and I'm going to try not to take sides on them. I think many of the examples that spring to mind are ones that you would probably reach the same conclusion from a variety of different ethical viewpoints. So I'm going to take it as a given that we do have duties to govern well for the long term in terms of responsibilities to future people and responsibilities to those currently alive and their long-term interests. The second kind of background thought is that many citizens, certainly of Western liberal democratic capitalist societies, are critical of governments for being very short-termist. And you can look at a wide variety of different policy areas where it seems that those governments have sort of fixated on the short term and neglected the long term. So paradigmatic examples would be climate change. We've known about the risks of climate change from at least the early 1990s, and yet many governments have dragged their feet and not implemented aggressive mitigation policies. The same is true of biodiversity loss. Our actions now, or our emissions now, have huge implications for biodiversity in the future, but many governments have not really done very much to protect biodiversity. You could run through a whole gamut of other policy areas and find a similar pattern. So, for example, in the European Union, it's widely accepted by people, whichever position they take on it, that there were structural problems in the euro, but governments were very reticent to try and tackle it, and they just engaged in firefighting for the here and now and kicked the can down the road. They kind of didn't want to grapple with the hard problems. There are lots of other examples, whether it's education or infrastructural investment, where a similar phenomenon has occurred. People have focused on the here and now and not engaged in proper preparation for the long term. So this then kind of raises the question, how could we do better? Right? How could we design political frameworks and institutions to govern well for the long term? And that's the focus of this talk. And what I want to do is really three things. The first two are really to explain why I think governing well for the long term is incredibly hard. And then the third is to try and think of ways of improving political institutions so that they can govern well for the long term. And I will be taking sort of my examples, mainly ones I'm familiar with, so countries like the United Kingdom, but I hope the conclusions have wider applicability, but that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about countries like the UK or USA or Western European countries. So parts 1 and 2 are why governing for the long term is really hard, and parts 3 are informed by that to try and think, well, but is it hopeless, or can we do things that make us govern better for the long term? So let me introduce what I mean by temporal mismatches. I'm going to do this in 2 steps. So in 1959, there was a book was published by someone who became a really leading thinker in international politics called Kenneth Waltz. And Waltz's question was, why is there conflict between states? And his answer said, look, you can have 3 types of explanation, what he called 3 images. The first image explained the phenomenon in terms of the features of human beings and human nature. The second said that the extent to which wars occur between states depends on the nature of the state. And so some people like Immanuel Kant have thought that republics don't go to war with other republics. That's a second image kind of explanation. It looks at the type of state. And then the third type of explanation, what he calls the third image, explains conflict between states in terms of the international system. And the thought is it's anarchic, there is no world state. And whenever you have an anarchy, it's going to be prone to conflict. So, as I said, this is all about international politics, but I think we could flip that framework and apply it to intertemporal politics, as to how each generation in time governs with respect to future ones. And when we're looking at why there might be short-term decision-making, one kind of answer is first image. It appeals to features of human nature. And I just want to run a couple of these, because sometimes people think, I don't have any problem thinking about the future. I'm a perfectly rational agent who governs well over time. But we have reasons to think that's a bit too rosy. So sometimes I think there are just cognitive limitations, and there's work by people like Michael Glantz, who's an environmental scientist, on how we're very bad at detecting creeping problems. And these are problems where there are incremental changes, little by little, and we don't notice it because they're so gradual, but over time, a huge problem emerges. He was talking about the Aral Sea and the way in which it became totally environmentally degraded. Others have a similar phenomenon. They talk about shifting baseline syndrome, where what they mean by that is what we take to be normal is something that we keep adjusting. So I might live near a forest and I look at it and I think that's the norm. But then, a few trees get chopped down and I readjust my baseline to think that's the norm. And then some more get cut down and I readjust the baseline. And before you know it, there's no forest there at all, but I've not really noticed it because the baseline keeps shifting. So if they're right about this, and very few people seem to disagree, we're going to have cognitive problems with noticing sort of creeping problems or slow moving catastrophes, as they've sometimes been called. Here's another phenomenon, what some psychologists, I think I've misspelt Lowenstein, I think there's an extra E in there, called projection bias, which is I look out my window here now and it's a nice sunny day. It's very hard for me to conceive of it being radically different. And so people are often very bad at anticipating crises because we engage in projection bias. We just project the present onto the future and find it incredibly difficult to imagine it being dangerous in a way that it isn't now. Personally, this sort of rings bells with me when I think about the onset of the global pandemic. It was hard to take in initially how radical its impacts would be. Other kind of cognitive problems we have here is positive illusion. So overestimating our capabilities and our control over events. And there's a really interesting literature on mega projects, which uniformly massively overspend because everyone engages in kind of wishful thinking about how much they can do with a limited budget and so on. And then there's all kinds of motivational limitations. So not just cognitive ones about overestimating our capacities, underestimating threats, but many psychologists argue that we're motivated by vivid images where we see suffering or pain right here in front of us, but statistical lives and computer projections, they don't really get the blood coursing through our veins and motivate us to act. And future people are the ultimate statistical lives, whereas current people, we can see their suffering here and now. You can see from the PowerPoint, there's a bunch of other kind of motivational limitations, whether it's weakness of the will or just procrastinating difficult problems. Tunneling is an interesting phenomenon. That's where when time is scarce, people tend to prioritize the urgent over the important. So they might keep putting off that crucial doctor's appointment for a checkup on their blood pressure because they've got an article to submit today, or they've got essays they've got to mark. And people just keep doing that. And then these problems build up. Many people use this to explain underinvestment in infrastructure. It doesn't seem urgent. So if there's cuts to be made to the budget, people will cut from there. So For these reasons, many people think that there are features in human psychology that make us ill-equipped to govern well for the long term. I don't think they're written in stone, and I want to come back to that. I'm not saying that there's no plasticity in human nature, but it seems uncontroversial that there are these general dispositions. So that's one aspect. That's the first image. Think of a second image now, which is looking at the internal structure of states. And as I said, I'm going to focus on those that I'm familiar with, sort of broadly democratic, in the loose sense of democratic, political institutions. Many people think that these have an inherent bias towards the short term. The most obvious reason is the incentive to win election or re-election at the next election. There's a big literature in political science on how governments spend a lot in the year or 6 months building up to an election, even though it might be wiser to not do so in terms of the general good. There's an electoral imperative to do that. And then there are other kind of just everyday phenomena. So government ministries are often assessed in terms of how well they've met their targets in this 6 month period or 3 month period. And that's going to induce something similar to what people call quarterly capitalism. And then budget cycles. Ministries are told if you need to spend your money by X. If you don't spend it by time X, you lose it. And also your budget for the future will be shrunk because you clearly don't need that kind of money. That's going to incentivize you to spend the money quickly, even if it would be better to set it aside and invest for something for the long term. And then here's a fourth factor, which is prevalent amongst a lot of states, which is outsourcing crucial government functions to private actors. So there's a lot of scandal in the UK at the moment about things like the provision of water and pollution in rivers. And one explanation of this, given by people right across the political spectrum, is, well, water utilities have been outsourced to private actors, and they have profit margins and they have short-term market incentive to make money. And so there's a mismatch then between their incentive structure and the adequate promotion of the public good. That's the second image kind of explanation. And yeah, let me move on to like a third image one. So I've looked at the features of human nature. I've looked at the internal incentive structures of like democratic systems, but think about governments over time. They are in a somewhat anarchic relation to each other. They are sovereign for a duration of time in which they hold office, and then someone else will take over, and then someone else will take over. And so that's like a vertical equivalent of a society of states where each is sovereign over a territory, but there's no one that's completely in charge. Each one is sovereign over a period of time, but as soon as the next lot come across, they can repeal whatever the previous ones did. And this has two implications for governing well for the long term. I mean, one is we have intertemporal collective action problems where Barack Obama, for example, put in some climate legislation. Donald Trump came into office and immediately repealed it all. You might think, why bother trying to do this if you know that the next actor is going to be able to undo it? I mean, in brackets, there are certain things which are very hard to reverse, but there are other things which it is easy to reverse, and that's what this is talking about. And then here's the second factor, which is what political economists call credible commitment problems. So imagine you're a state A and you're committed to dealing with climate change, but you realize you need other states to cooperate with you. So you tell B, you should mitigate too, and we'll all do it. And no one will lose an advantage in the global marketplace. But B will say, how do I know that you, A, are going to keep on doing this in the future? I don't have any kind of credible commitment that you will in fact do that in the future, because B is fully well aware that the A's successors might take a different view, and then B might think, well, why bother cooperating now to achieve this long-term goal if I can't be assured that UA will keep on doing that? And there's a huge literature in political economy on credible commitment being really important to get cooperation going, but quite hard to achieve. Now, if they're right, then this intertemporal anarchy is very problematic. It's hard to get sufficient cooperation to achieve long-term goals, given the openness of the future. I mean, it's why many governments try and tie their hands in the future, to use Jon Elster's analogy from Ulysses and the Sirens, right? They try and bind themselves to the mast to transmit to others that they are in this for the long haul. Okay, and then let me just make one further point, and this is where I go beyond the Waltzian kind of language, which is another feature of intertemporal politics is, of course, that many people who have to live with the outcomes are not yet born, and they lack voice and accountability mechanisms. So they can't campaign, they can't lobby, they can't convey their opinions to the government, they can't vote, they can't hold decision makers to account. They just live with the world that others have made. And they are powerless. And the contrast then is with a democratic system in which those who are affected actually do have power and they can hold the leadership to account. So you might appeal to this to think, well, it's not surprising that governments don't govern for the long term, given that they're not going to be held to account by lots of the people because they don't exist. So those are 4 types of factor, and what I'm calling the 4 temporal mismatches follows from these. And apologies for my totally amateur graphs, but I struggle to do these, so I'm not sure I've got them quite right. But what I'm calling a mismatch is, if you can read the text at the bottom, it says, look, there's often a mismatch between the relevant time span for addressing a problem and people's motivations. So let's take depositing nuclear waste, which can be radioactive for 100,000 years. The duration of the problem is incredibly long, but people's motivations to protect future interests doesn't extend anywhere near that far in the future, and the slope of the graph will vary depending on people's discount rates. But the broad point is that you might get a problem that's like this long, but people's motivations only extend this far, and that's a mismatch. You really want people to be motivated for the whole period to treat it adequately. I focused here on the motivational features of human nature. I couldn't think of how to describe or model the cognitive ones, but there is a cognitive mismatch, and it was captured once in the 1950s by Gunther Anders, who was a German philosopher who's incredibly worried about nuclear weapons. And he said that human beings in the 1950s were like inverted utopians. Your normal utopian has dreams which outstrip their powers. They have visions of this world, but they just don't have the political power to realize it. He said, we're inverted utopians. We have these powers, but they outstrip our imagination. We just can't get our head around the kind of things that we're able to do. And I don't know if that's hyperbolic, but I think he was onto something there. And that's a kind of another mismatch. It's saying there's a mismatch between our capacities to understand phenomena and our powers. So this will make governing for the long term really hard. It means there's a misalignment between the way human beings think and the extent of their powers. Think then about the second image. Think about within, as I keep repeating, within a democratic state, its incentive structures. You might have a problem P that lasts for a very long time, but what incentive does a government have to govern that far in the future? Not a lot, because its incentive is really guided by the next election. It needs to win re-election or election, and so its temporal horizons will be 4 or 5 years, even though the problem might be 30 years, 50 years, 1,000 years, or whatever. So there's a misalignment then between the incentive structure of political leaders here and the time frame over which a problem lasts. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. But you can hopefully just see the sort of the dynamic about the mismatch of the temporal horizons of political leaders and the duration of problems. Here's the third image. So the third image says you've got just a series of governments over time, one and after another, but each is sovereign over their time period, but not over the next, not over the following one. So again, we'll have a mismatch here because we'll have a problem that requires action over a long period of time. But we've just got lots of different agents then, and government one can't ensure that it's fully achieved over time. It has to cooperate with government two and government three and government four, but it has no power over them. They don't have any power over it. It seems like life would be a lot easier if a government had a task to solve something in 5 years and it had a 5-year period in power. That would be a neat fit. We don't have that. So I think it would be unsurprising then, given this mismatch, that it would be hard to govern for the long term. And then the fourth one is this: it's to do with the fact that there are people in the future they're absent from the political process. And so the time period for implementing a policy might be that colored in area, but the number of people subject to the effects will include not just them, but many other people. And so there's a mismatch in terms of who is affected by the decision, parking any parfit-like worries about the non-identity problem here, but who has to live with the decision and who actually might have some control over it. Now, these are not maybe as cast iron as I'm presenting it. I think there are there are complications which soften the message I'm conveying here. But I hope you can see in this somewhat stark relief that there are problems of governing for the long term to do with these mismatches. So there's a mismatch between, on the one hand, the time span needed to address a problem satisfactorily, and on the other hand, the time span during which citizens are motivated to act and their cognitive capacities. And there's the mismatch between the duration of these problems and the incentives facing governments concerning their abilities in power and who has to live with the decisions and who can influence the decisions. I think often we do many things that benefit future generations, often intentionally and often as byproducts of things that favor us now. So lots of innovation, education, technological advances, scientific understanding. We can do lots of things which aid future generations. I'm not trying to present a relentlessly pessimistic image, but there are reasons you might think that it's going to be very hard to govern well for the future. At least that's what I've hoped to persuaded you of so far. The reason I'm doing all of this is I think that there are lots of people now arguing here are ways of designing institutions to cope well with the future. I think we have to know what we're up against. We have to know the nature of the problem. And that's why I'm trying to identify, in a way, the structure of the problem. Think again, though, about designing institutions for the future. Another thing we need to know is about the type of problems there might be. And by this, I don't mean the sort of thing that Toby Ord does in The Precipice, for those who are familiar with this, which is he kind of compares climate change, for example, with global pandemics, or AI. I think that's a very valuable kind of exercise, hard to do, but very valuable. I mean something somewhat more abstract. And so I now want to introduce kind of the next phase, which is what makes problems for the long term hard to deal with adequately. I think in the meditations, Descartes conjured up an evil genius or even demon and thought, imagine there is one and they're trying to deceive you. And his attempt was to try and find out what beliefs we could hold, without doubt. But I think of his device, but readjusted. Imagine there's an evil demon and they're trying to create problems for the future that are really hard to deal with adequately. What would they be trying to do? What kind of features would they give them to make it hard to govern for the future? Here's my answer. So I think they would think, well, what do we want systems to have to govern well for the future? We'd want them to have three types of property. One is epistemic, so a good ability to detect future problems, good ability to understand them and know how to best respond to them. Well-functioning systems would be ones in which people are motivated to act in the interests of the long term. And well-functioning systems would be ones in which people not only understand the future threats and are motivated to deal with them well, but they have the power to do that. They have the capacity to govern well in the interests of the long term. And I think the evil demon would then think about, well, what problems could I design that would make it hard to perform well on this epistemic or motivational or agentic dimension? To put it the other way around, suppose there is, I think Kim Stanley Robinson has a book that came out about 2 years ago called Ministry of the Future. But imagine you're in the Ministry of the Future. What are the kinds of problems you would most dread? And I think, let's go through the epistemic, the motivation, and the agency. So I think there are lots of problems that pose big challenges to our cognitive capacities. So ones in which there's no warning signals at all, clearly it's going to be next to impossible to govern well for the long term. But also ones where there are warning signals, but there's considerable uncertainty. Or what I think Nicholas Taleb has in mind when he calls black swans, which are utterly unpredictable, massive events. It's very hard to govern those in advance, as opposed to ones where you see a meteor coming towards Earth and you know the probabilities very well. Other properties that might make problems really hard to deal with is ones I've already mentioned, like creeping, gradually accumulating problems. Another feature you might want is novel problems. And I'm building here on what Kahneman and Tversky call the availability heuristic. And they say when we're estimating probabilities, we're often guided by the ease with which we can bring to mind examples. So my probabilistic assessment of a future global pandemic will be different now because I can call to mind one. But an utterly unfamiliar novel problem, it's hard. The fact that we can't bring examples to bear makes us underestimate its probability. So the evil genius would try and come up with novel problems. And if they really want to be mean, they would come up with novel problems that look like familiar problems. So I remember some UK health experts saying that COVID was a bit like a bad case of influenza and wasn't a good basis on which to make policies. And then you'd want problems which are causally incredibly complex and really hard to understand. That's kind of obvious. And again, novel problems are not just ones that affect our probabilistic assessment, but we're often at a loss what to do. And again, we see this with the COVID pandemic. Some societies were more familiar with pandemics and were better equipped to deal with it, whereas others of us were paralyzed by it, thinking we just don't know how to respond. So the nastiest problems, I think, will often have some of these epistemic features that they'll be hard to detect. Let's move on. Some problems put much more pressure on our motivational capacities. So some long-term problems come with costs first and then the benefits later. and particularly costs for powerful actors now for benefits to others later is a bad combination to have. Other long-term problems, and just think back to the images, I don't think all long-term problems are that hard to deal with if there are ones which benefit current people now and also benefit future people. So that's why I said we should kind of soften some of the messages I was giving earlier. Not all long-term problems are hard to govern with if the payoffs are such that they benefit people now and people in the future. The difficult ones are ones that come with cost now and benefit later, especially cost now for powerful actors and benefit later. There's a nice passage in Locke on a treatise on human understanding where he says, who would get drunk if you had the hangover first and then the pleasure of drinking? The sequencing of the pleasures and the pains matter to what people do. Incidentally, Montaigne said exactly the same thing. Moving on, another feature that makes problems for the long-term tricky would be remoteness in time. I mean, people generally have pure time discount rates and they find it hard to be motivated by things in the far future. So the further off in the future, the harder it is to motivate people to act. And then another thing is, suppose you have a problem and you can deal with it in a short duration of time. That's going to be easier to deal with one that requires constant vigilance and resolve and commitment over time. And I think you see this in why lots of foreign interventions do not work, because these are long-term projects. People's commitment starts to wilt over time because they see the body bags coming home. You see it in environmental issues. There's what Anthony Downs called the issue attention cycle, that people get bored of it, they get used to it. It's hard to keep motivation going for a long period of time. So, your evil demon will want problems that front load costs on current people for benefits in the future, and that require commitment over a considerable period of time. And then let's think about not just the motivational aspect, but the capacity to act. So some problems are just harder to deal with others because some of them are systemic in nature. Where you've got a problem that arises because an individual actor behaves wrongly, it's a lot easier to deal with ones where it's just inbuilt into the system. For example, Marxists writing on climate change just think climate change is inherent in the capitalist system. Now, put to one side whether they're right about that or not. If they're right, it's going to be really hard to deal with it because you need a system change, and that doesn't look likely. Then other features that make things hard to deal with will be the number of agents. The more you need global cooperation and the more you need cooperation over time, those are harder problems to deal with for the long term, other things being equal. Whereas ones that require less cooperation are just going to be more straightforward. When I talk to people who work on local government about governing well for the long term, they're somewhat slightly mystified about why it should be hard, because often there's kind of social capital invested in it. People trust the local authority, and it doesn't require huge interaction and cooperation over different actors. But think of a global problem. Think of regulating AI for the future between many different governments over time, and that's just a harder problem to deal with. And then here's a final limitation on capacity, which is irreversibility. If you had two problems, one of which is if you get it wrong when you respond to it the first time, you can always have another go. It's a lot easier to deal with one that creates path dependencies, and as soon as you engage in an action, it is impossible to reverse. It's like a Pandora's box that once you've opened it, you can't unopen it. And I have not kept abreast of the developments with AI that have happened this year, but I could see someone might argue that lots of technological developments are ones that once they're open, you just cannot put them back in the box. And that kind of irreversibility makes problems harder to deal with. So let me just note two other features that make problems hard to deal with. And this is when you get, let's say, two properties mixed together. So what I'm calling the motivation action dilemma is when it's imperative to act at one time, let's call it T1, but people aren't motivated to act until another time, T2. If you're lucky, T2 happens before T1, but you may not be, it may come after T1, in which case the fact that it's imperative to act at T1 is not in itself a problem. And the fact that people are motivated to act at T2 is not in itself a problem, but the combination of them is a problem. And this is not a kind of a purely logical possibility. People like Mark Caney, who was the former governor of the Bank of England, coined this phrase, what he called the tragedy of the horizon. And he said, thinking about the city in particular, that it has exactly the profile I've just described, that the time to act was now or 10 or 20 years ago, but the major actors in finance, the business cycle, the political cycle, are not going to be motivated until the problem is much closer, by which time it's too late. And so not all long-term problems will have this feature, but where you have this kind of bad combination between when it's imperative to act and when people are motivated, you're going to have a problem. And then, and this is going to conclude the second part, another kind of problem you're going to have is ones where it's imperative to act at one time, but you don't really have enough knowledge until somewhat later. And David Collingridge, who was an expert on technology, wrote about this, calling it what he termed the dilemma of control. And he said often you get a situation where the change is easy, but the need for it cannot be foreseen. So think of the early stages of a technological development. But then you get a later stage where you realize there's a need for change, but then it's become much more difficult or expensive, or maybe not even possible. And so here the problem is that when you know you need to act is not the same as when action would have been optimal to prevent the harm. Just to show this is not particularly new, you may have seen this was quoted a lot in the early stages of the pandemic, but Niccolo Machiavelli said something like this in The Prince. He says often, it's important to anticipate future problems, but in the early stages, it's easy to deal with, but you don't have enough knowledge to know whether it's really a threat. Later on, you'll have the knowledge that it's a threat, but it's too late to prevent it from happening. And he said, this is, you often get diseases like this, but also political disorders. They're quickly healed if they're seen well in advance, but they're really hard to see well in advance. And so you get problems then where there's this knowledge action dilemma. So just to put all of this in context, then it's not just that human beings or institutions are kind of not well designed to cope with these problems. It's that some problems themselves have features that make them difficult to govern well. And I should say in public policy, there's been a long debate about concepts which are called wicked problems or super wicked problems. And what I'm saying here is in the same genre, although it's slightly different. I've tried to give a systematic account of what makes governing well for the future hard. And it'll be hard when there are factors which make it hard to realize the epistemic features you want to have. So when there's not much evidence, when it's a new problem, when it's very complex. It'll be hard when it attacks the motivational capacities of institutions, when it's contrary to the self-interest of current powerful actors, when it's temporally remote, when it requires sort of commitment and resolve over time. And they'll be hard to deal with when yeah, they require cooperation between many actors when they're irreversible, and so on. I put this in a kind of a negative way, but you could put it in a positive way, which is not all problems for the long term are that hard to deal with. Sometimes they might be easy when they're familiar, when we can see them coming, when they're not novel, when dealing well with the future actually coincides with dealing well for the current, when we have problems that are more local and don't require extensive cooperation. So I think when you're looking at the earlier mismatches I talked about, it's just worth bearing in mind that, for example, the fact that a problem lasts for a really long time does not necessarily make it hard to deal with if it's in the interest of the current actors to deal with it here and now. The fact that it lasts for 100,000 years doesn't make it insuperable at all, because they might have perfectly normal, short-sighted reasons and incentives to deal with it. So I guess the point I'm trying to drive home here is not all problems are the same, and some of them will be easier, some of them will be harder, and I've tried to draw attention to the factors that make the easy ones easy and the hard ones hard. So yeah, then you might think, yeah, what is to be done? I'm going to now draw attention to ways in which we might try and design institutions bearing in mind these drivers of short-termism, and bearing in mind to some extent the heterogeneity of the different problems. And yeah, if I had more time, I would say, well, if you look around the world, you see lots of experiments of governments trying to govern well for the long term. And lots of innovative things have been tried, and it would be interesting to talk about some of those. So Wales, for example, created a Future Generations Commissioner in 2015. Finland has a committee for the future. Hungary under Viktor Orban has sort of abolished it, but Hungary used to have an ombudsman for future generations. Lots of constitutions now created that have provisions affirming intergenerational equity, and many people talk about using courts. Countries in Eastern Europe now are often experimenting with having foresight councils and commissions for the future. So there's a lot going on. And at the global level, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, 2 years ago, issued a report with lots of innovative ideas for changing the global institutional architecture to make it better equipped to govern for the long term. So there's a lot going on in this space, and rather than talk about it at that concrete level, I want to kind of do it in a more abstract way and think, well, I think let's think about the causes of the problem and proceed on that basis. Just like if I was trying to persuade you of some remedy for dealing with inflation or unemployment, you'd want me to know what the causes of inflation or unemployment are before you're going to listen to any remedy. You shouldn't listen to that, because I don't know anything about the causes of either of those. So let's think about first image factors. I mentioned cognitive and motivational limitations. I did say we shouldn't assume that these are fixed and invariant. And there's quite a lot of social scientific literature on how these are variable. And two factors in particular seem to me salient, which is one, that when people are in poverty, they understandably focus more on the short term and making ends meet in the short term. And there's just a big literature in economics and to some extent economic history. So if you really want citizens to be motivated to care about the long term, you should lift them out of poverty. I mean, I think you should do that anyway, but it would be a beneficial byproduct of poverty alleviation and eradication. A second factor is people are not going to think about the future and invest for the future, for example, if there's massive political instability or an uncertainty. And I mentioned de Tocqueville, but there's lots of empirical studies on how people's investment decisions for the future. You know, why would you invest in a country if you thought its future was unstable? So instability is a cause of short-termism. let's have stability. So I think we shouldn't just kind of take people's dispositions as given. We should think about ways in which we might tackle the social determinants of myopia. Here are some other maybe more speculative thoughts drawing on stuff I've argued before. You might think that if human beings by disposition have a tendency to let the present crowd out the future, well, then we can design artifices or devices to make us think about the future. We could build into the parliamentary calendar, visions of the future day where people from civil society or political parties should debate and propose their visions of the future of that country. You could have a requirement that governments and political parties issue their manifestos for the future. In other words, you kind of engage in some architectural design of your environment to make the future more salient. And we do that all the time when we're trying to make ourselves think about the future. So why not do that for political life? If people don't really think about the future or don't understand the future challenges, well, then we should have a council for the future that issues reports. And often there are ones. The UK government has foresight reports, but they are quite dry and technical. And that leads to the other thing, which is if people tend to be more swayed by vivid images of suffering or human flourishing, as opposed to dry abstract computer projections, then this should affect the way we convey information and not use the graphs that things like the IPCC use, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Those of you who know your Aristotle know in the Rhetoric, he says that people are often not motivated to think about the future, and we need to make things vivid and to convey what life would be like with some great opportunity that we might exploit for the future or some great threat. So I'm just trying to work back from some of the limitations to think, well, what would remedy that? Yeah, you might think, well, if politicians tend to procrastinate, and certainly in the UK, there's extensive evidence they do. For example, there's a pensions crisis like there is in many aging societies, but they've known about this for decades, but they just avoided dealing with it because it was a hard issue to deal with. Well, when individuals procrastinate, they're often told to have implementation plans and concrete plans as to what they're going to do. We could design institutions to, like having committees which scrutinize any proposals so that they're not just airy, abstract, vague pronouncements, but they have implementation plans. So you could try and mitigate tendencies for procrastination. And if you think human beings have a tendency to ignore long-term impacts, then you can require all legislation to include what Dennis Thompson at Harvard calls posterity impact statements. So statements about the future impacts of current decisions. Just make it harder for people to ignore the future. Let's think about the second image. So again, I'm focusing on sort of liberal democratic capitalist states. I talked about the effects that elections have on short-termism, but what I didn't say is that political scientists will tell us you should not treat all democratic systems as identical. What really matters for governing for the long term is what Alan Jacobs calls electoral safety. And different systems protect electoral safety to different degrees. So a first past the post system is incredibly prone to short-termism, because if you implement some policy, you may never see its benefits because you're thrown out of office, especially if it comes with costs first and benefits later. But some scholars like Johannes Lindvall have pointed out that ones where there's power sharing, there's much more electoral safety, because those in power sharing schemes, even if they introduce unpopular legislation, they're not going to get obliterated from office. There's much less electoral competition in one sense, because you don't get the big swings that you get in majoritarian systems. So he argues that power sharing democracies are less prone to short-termism than power concentrated ones. And if that's right, you can soften the blow of the electoral effect. Similarly, Jared Finnegan has found that democracies with proportional representation are much more likely to implement far-sighted climate policies than other ones. Why? Well, because even if they get punished a bit in the vote, that they still have, they won't be obliterated and they will still be able to hold office in some form. Okay. Let me just double check the time. Yeah, okay. Think about another factor. So I said many people think that certain states don't govern well for the long term because they outsource their core functions to private actors who are driven by the market imperative. Well, don't do this then, right? Don't outsource these to private actors. And Brett Christophers talks about things like infrastructure, which is outsourced to asset managing companies who have to make their profits within 10 years. They have no incentive to govern well for the long term, that they want to be in there for 10 years to make as much money as they can and then pass it on. Offer talks about public finance, public-private partnerships in the UK. Again, many of these, the private actors didn't have long-term ambitions. They were in there to maximize their profit. So there's an institutional remedy, which is don't engage in these public-private partnerships, don't outsource core functions to private actors. Then think about the third image one. So each generation is kind of sovereign, but is powerless over future ones. Well, some people like Jon Elster, and before him, Thomas Schelling, and before them both, Strotz have argued, well, maybe there's pro tanto reason to have some kind of binding and commitment mechanisms that when a government passes one law, it can bind future ones, or it can set up devices that tie the hands of future generations. And these can be quite modest. I mean, you could have a sovereign wealth fund where you set money aside in this, and then you pass legislation saying that you and other governments, are limited in your capacity to draw on it. It's a binding mechanism, just like Elster's canonical use of Ulysses and the Sirens. It comes with its normative problems because people, you will also want to respect the self-determination of future political communities, but there's a balance to be struck there. And then, well, what about the fact that future people aren't here, right, and they can't say what they think or what they want? In one sense, I think this is just insoluble, right? But there are proxies, right? There are things we could do as a second best. So there's a future design lab in Tokyo, directed by Saijo, and he and his colleagues have sort of proposed and experimented with models where, under one version, the decision makers, some of them are told that they must act out the role of being future generations. So in the deliberations, some people are told your current generations and others are told your future people, and looked at the decisions reached under these conditions. So you get people to role play, essentially. But the attempt is to internalize the perspective of future people. Another version that they've experimented with it, which makes some difference, is getting everyone to look at it from the point of view of future people and to internalize that viewpoint and then make decisions. So they're required to have an assessment of how things will look in the future, to look at it from the point of view of people 50 years in the future, say. They're never going to be the same as having those other people in the room, but there are things we can do, is their point. And then you might just create offices where people's role is to act as guardian for future generations or commissioner for future generations. And some have even proposed this at the global level. There's been campaigns for now 30 years for a high commissioner for future generations. And I've looked at some of these proposals elsewhere. So the point about these is, I suppose the case was nicely put by the government of Malta, actually, when it called for a high commissioner for future generations. It said, future people are powerless. Let's think about how we deal with others who don't have the power to protect themselves, like children. We often create legally appointed guardians to try and canvass and campaign on their interests. Could we not similarly design institutions where people have this role? There are problems. I mean, why assume that anyone in that role would necessarily discharge it with the best intentions and conscientiously? But maybe that's something we could take up in the Q&A. So let me just wrap up now with one final point and then the summary. If we just think about the heterogeneity of long-term problems, I think several points come out. So one is, given the heterogeneity, there will just not be one silver bullet which will be able to deal with future problems. There's just no one-size-fits-all remedy. The second point is the epistemic challenges really worry me, and they lead some people, including I think Nicholas Taleb, to say, look, the focus should really be on coping and adapting and being anti-fragile. Some problems just will not be able to be prevented in advance. And here's a real sting, which is, I've quoted Johannes Lindvall earlier, and he said power sharing schemes are better at governing for the long term, but they're worse at coping with crises. Power concentration schemes are better at governing in crises, but are worse at governing for the long term. That's a kind of a difficult combination that I haven't really thought through. Third point, look, some of these problems come with costs now and benefits later. And if we're to deal with them, we may need to change the payoffs to compensate some of those who are disadvantaged now, so that they will be persuaded to govern well for the long term. We can't ignore the fact that they will be harmed in the short term, and they won't act unless compensated. And then if we think about the capacity related problems, it just seems to me to put a premium on putting the foundations for cooperation, both over time but over space, in place, so that when something does occur, it's easier to cooperate than harder. Okay, I have come to the end now. So I've tried to do quite a lot, probably maybe too much, but I've tried to explain why governing for the long term is hard, because I think there are these temporal mismatches. I've tried to bring out the heterogeneity of intertemporal problems and to provide a systematic way of identifying what makes problems hard to deal with. And I've closed by reflecting on some ways, and I emphasize the some because it's not exhaustive, of designing institutions maybe to better overcome short-termism. And thank you very much for your patience. I really look forward to questions, comments, objections, and so on. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Caney. That was a fascinating talk. So we have about 30 minutes left for questions. So if you have a question, of course, use the hand raising function. If you have a follow-up to a question, just type it in the chat. So we follow the usual convention. So I will note down people's names as they raise their hands. So Andrea, you're first.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Professor Caney, for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and I also enjoy all your writings. Now, I have a just very basic and simple question. Well, what do you mean by long term? At least it's I guess you expected that, but as you might, of course, I'm sure you know. On some understandings of what long-term can mean, some problems related to motivation may arise or not. If it is 10, 15 years, let's say, a long term, then I might have some reasons to care about the future, because I have a son. I hope that he will have in turn some other, whatever, there could be some, let's say, selfish reasons for me to care about future generations, or let's say the long term in that sense. Whereas we might have bigger problems when we think about the long term, as some other people think about the long term, long-termists, as some people call themselves, where they think about the whole possible future of humanity. So I was wondering what you have in mind when you talk about this, the designing the political structures or whatever.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a fully adequate answer, but here's how I think about it. So I tend to think about it from a moral, practical point of view. So people often say governments are very short-termist, and I think, well, that's not necessarily a problem. Where it's a problem is where you have a problem that's lasting for longer than they are focusing on. And so, for example, there will be no, so what I'm building up to, there's no uniquely correct statement of what the long term should be. It will vary on the nature of the problem. So if someone is looking at the pensions crisis in, let's say, Western liberal democratic societies, you might think they should be thinking about 30 years, because let's just suppose that that's the appropriate time frame for resolving that problem, and it's to do with declining birth rates, and so then someone would be wrongfully short-termist if they're not thinking about 30 years. But it doesn't require thinking about 50 years or 60 or 70, because the nature of the problem is such that it should be resolved in that time period. Whereas for nuclear waste, it lasts for 100,000 years. And so I think if someone says, I'm thinking about the long term, I'm thinking for like 100 years in advance, I might think that's not appropriately long-termist, because the appropriate time frame should be 100,000 years. And then we could just do this for lots of other problems. And so I'm trying to give it, in a sense, what I would call a moralized definition of what being appropriately long-term is. It's as long-term as the duration of the problem or the challenge. So it could be that someone is focusing only on the next 3 months, and they should really be thinking about 3 years. And I'd think they're being myopic, right? They're being short-sighted. They should take a longer time frame, but I might just mean 3 years. I don't know if this makes sense, but this is kind of how so I thought we should be guided by the normative criteria of our responsibilities into the future, and then the different problems, this will come up with different time frames. It does mean institutional design is really hard then, because for example, some people say we should include the youth in decision-making processes because then it would be more long-termist. But unless the youth, I think what they tend to mean by that is that the youth will be affected by decisions slightly further into the future. So they'll look slightly further ahead. But if you're thinking about things that are 1,000 years in the future, including the youth, I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference. So unless they have just different dispositions, as young people, they are more altruistically concerned for the long term. So does that make sense? It's not directly answering the question, but it's sort of from a practical point of view, what counts as long-term or short-term should be guided by our responsibilities and the nature of the problems we're dealing with.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Does anybody else have a question? Yeah, Faye.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Actually, my question is also related to Andrew's. So in your talk, you mentioned that in some cases, like the cost and the benefit actually appears in a kind of sequence. So the cost appears first, and then the benefit appear in the future. Well, I see this as less problematic than the case in which the benefit is something like less likely to foresee in the future. But like in a case in which like you could foresee the benefit in future, people are more likely to motivate. For example, Andrew's case, that knowing, he has a son, so he knows in the future it will definitely, or is a high likelihood that will benefit some, even though the benefit appear in the future, people are kind of more likely to be motivated. But if benefit is hard to foresee, even in the near future, that's occurred to me like more kind of problematic scenario than just a kind of sequence between cost and the benefit. Yeah, so I would like to see what do you think about this problems?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. So if I've got it right, we should look not just at the sequence of benefits and burdens, but also the probabilities. And it's certainly when people object to governing for the long term, or either in good faith or bad faith, or what they will say is something like, it's definitely got costs now for potential benefits, or it's uncertain whether there'll be benefits, or there's a low probability of being benefits. So yeah, that will make it hard, is when the benefits may be great, but yeah, we have a low probability. Yeah, or just that we don't know the probability and it's sort of shrouded in uncertainty. No, I totally agree. I think I think that does make it hard. But do you think the sequencing makes no difference, or it might make some difference, but the thing that it can be outweighed by other factors? Other things can.
Yes, I think that the sequence still matters for between persons who are short-sighted and long-term prospect. But even for those persons who has the long-term mindset, it will make differences of those benefits which is foreseeable and those benefits which is not. It's just that, for some cases, it's just that for example, AI, we just don't have a lot of data, like in the history or in the past, for us to make a kind of good predictions of what the benefits in the future would be. So that seems to me like in this sort of like AI cases, the unforeseeable or benefits which is hard to accurately foresee seems more kind of salient problems. But it depends on the case, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, there's another factor here which I should bring in, which is it's not the case that people will never go for pain first and benefit later. For example, austerity measures. Often people vote for governments that put in austerity, so cutting benefits, and they will be told this is going to be painful, this is going to be difficult, but we need to get the house in order. And a lot of people find that I don't agree with those policies, but a lot of people do find that persuasive, and they're willing to make sacrifices now for future benefits. And war. I mean, people often say, I'm thinking about British political leaders, they often say, I think Winston Churchill, I've got nothing to offer you but blood, pain, and sacrifice. So yeah, the sequencing matters, but it can be overcome by other factors, including those I've just mentioned, but also, the probabilistic element. The only thing I think about the probability one is that the more uncertain the benefits, then I'm not sure the government is acting wrongfully in being short-termist there. If there's definite costs and there are low probability benefits, then it begins to raise the question, well, should we actually be doing this? It depends if the benefits are incredibly high, right? And then even with a low probability, we might. But yeah, I suppose I'm trying to explain why people might make mistakes. But in this case, the more we talk about the uncertainty of the benefits, the more we might think, it's not actually a mistake to be focused on the short-term costs there. Yeah, so this is a long, wordy way of saying I agree with your point. I think you're right that probabilities must, of course, matter in this assessment. Yeah, totally. So on AI, since the benefits are often quite speculative and we don't have reliable probabilities, it might be a tough ask, I guess. Yeah. Thank you.
Dan Marshall.
Hi, so I've just got a clarificatory question about your proposal 1, which was, or at least the first part of that, which was to reduce or eliminate poverty. I was just wondering whether you're using like an absolute notion of poverty, or like a relative notion where relative means relative to your own community. So because on that second proposal, second underway of understanding, what you're saying is we need, long term, we need to reduce inequality. Well, on a first way of understanding, it's like, oh yeah, we've got to get people up to a certain level, and then we can kind of, don't care about inequality anymore.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. I hadn't thought that through. So, but thinking about the literature I was drawing on, I think their concern, it was really about absolute poverty rather than comparative levels. And so it was to do with absolute poverty rather than inequality between people. And I mean, here's a contemporary example of it when Emmanuel Macron put forward a proposal for a carbon tax. I think it was 2018 or something. And then the yellow vest movement, the Gilets jaunes movement, kind of protested against this. There was a slogan that his then environment minister coined before he resigned on air, which was, you've got to think about the end of the month as well as the end of the world, meaning, so the carbon tax was combined. I mean, so lots of people in rural communities were going to be really hit by this because there was going to be a tax on use of petrol, and they were getting no concessions, and they were just wondering how they could go about their livelihoods and pay the bills. So I think the logic of there is people want to have enough to pay their bills that they can't even think about the future beyond just making ends meet. And so that strikes me as the making kind of absolute poverty levels. And then above that, maybe it won't have the same kind of effect, right? So it's not that the more and more wealthy people get, the more far-sighted they become. Does that, I don't know if that speaks to what you were.
So the considerations you just raised seem to push for a relative notion of poverty rather than absolute, I always thought, because like paying your bills, well, now our bills include electricity and a bunch of things, and we keep a refrigerator going. But 300 years ago, no one had a refrigerator.
Okay.
So it seems like, as time goes on, what counts as poor changes. And now, if you don't have enough electricity to have your refrigerator, you're poor. But yeah, and as time goes by, what counts as poor is presumably going to, change as well. So it seems like it's
okay. I'm with you. Yeah, no, I'm with you. Okay, I get that. No, I think that's right. What I meant, so I think it's complicated then, isn't it? I think their concern, I'm sure they were bothered by other being wealthier in France than they were, but the relevant dynamic here was making ends meet. But then you're quite right to say that what people count as meeting their needs is going to be variable over time and is not fixed, and it won't just be subsistence, like physical ones. It might be having access to the internet and so on. So yeah, that's true. So yeah, it won't be some kind of invariant over time and place level. But what I suppose I was thinking of is, so yeah, I actually favor, just independently of all of this, sort of a much more egalitarian approach that says everyone should have equal opportunities to flourish. So it wouldn't just be going for meeting basic needs, but something stronger than that. But from the point of view of this argument, it seemed to be the emphasis was not on there are inequalities between citizens, but people just don't have the luxury of thinking about the future because they're worried about unemployment now and the cost of living crisis now. And I totally agree that what people take to be their needs will be, social, kind of sociologically informed by the type of society they're in. There's interesting historical studies where French farmers were berated by the central government for not investing in new technologies and not thinking about the future. And the reply from the French farmers was, we can't afford to take that risk. because if we make a misstep and gamble on some new technological innovation for farming, and it doesn't work, we're not going to survive till the next year. So it was that kind of thing that was uppermost on my mind. But I need to, yeah, thank you. It's very helpful. I need to be more careful about how I specify that, and what it exactly entails in terms of socioeconomic policies. Here's one rider, by the way. I mean, the highest greenhouse gas emissions come from the most wealthy. So there's a kind of slightly interesting paradox here that middle-class people are more likely to vote for long-sighted policies, but in their private life are more likely to do policies that harm the long term, like emit lots of greenhouse gases. So this whole area is quite complicated, I think.
Does anybody else have a question? While we're waiting for people to jump in, I actually had a few questions myself. So firstly, I thought this was very good. It was very clear and persuasive. I think my problem is that you presented the various problems here so well that I think now the problem's even more difficult than I thought it was previously. And I already thought it was a difficult problem. And one of the things that came to me when you were in the tail end of your talk regarding the positive proposals we could experiment with was that some of them seem to me to have important costs that we should take into account. So, for example, you mentioned proposals wherein we could bind future governments to what I would say a present-day government might do. But then if the present-day government makes a very bad decision, either ineffective for governing for the future or even harmful, that might be bad because you're going to bind these future generations to poor decisions. And then another one was, see if I can check my notes here. So just in general about sort of global proposals, one worry that you might have, and people like Taleb would share, is that I think global governance might be fragile in the sense that if it's overly centralized and somebody makes a mistake at the top, that error might ramify throughout the entire system in a way that's hard to wind back. So I guess my question is, out of this suite of proposals, are there any that you favor because they seem to deliver some of these benefits in a more clear way without incurring these trade-offs or negative unintended consequences?
Yeah, no, I share a lot the way you just presented things. So I'm much more confident in my analysis of why it's hard and the problems than any answers. And I think I agree with you about the binding ones. I mean, that's partly the problem, is it kind of relates in a way to irreversibility. But if you deliberately try and make it irreversible, what if you get it wrong, right? And I think about what people thought 100 years ago about the big worries in the world. They wouldn't have had a clue about the kind of problems we're actually facing. So, I think I sort of said we have to balance considerations here, but that's unhelpfully vague. But I can't, I'm not any further along on thinking about how we trade off, on the one hand, the value of collective self-determination, that the next generation is entitled to have, and not being dominated by an erroneous decision maker. On the other hand, thinking about this perpetual flux of decision making, which means that no long-term plans can be executed. And so I just think it's a genuine, deep tension there. And you find it in economics. I mean, in economics, economists have been talking about this for a lot longer, I think, than a lot of political philosophers. And they worried about discretion versus rules. So if you have discretionary systems, then it's hard to make a decision now because someone will think, well, how do I know you're going to do that in the future? So then they impose rules, and this is partly the case for independent central banks. But what if you, as you say, you mal-designed it in the first place, or the rule was inflexible and there were some exceptions that you would have put in there now if you'd thought about it but didn't. And I don't think they're any further along thinking, how do you juggle this? So I suppose I just agree with you that there are problems there. The way I think about the drive, here's my kind of overall take on it. The way I think about the drivers is there might be some drivers of short-termism that are in a way insoluble. So the fact that future people can't be present to articulate what they think, there's no getting around that. And then there are others which might be soluble but at high moral cost. And then the golden one, right, is there are ones that we can do something about, and it's not high moral risk, or there's even beneficial. And I don't know that there are many in that third category. So I do think I do think some fall into that category. So I do think there are lots of things we could do now that benefit current generations that would benefit the future. So I think lifting people out of poverty and having political stability are just good for them now, and it's good for the future. I think lots of policies like investing in education and medicine and science are good for now and they're good for the future. I do think not outsourcing government functions to private actors would be a good thing and doesn't come at a moral cost, I don't think. I think, yeah, some economists of the 1990s might have thought otherwise. They might think outsourcing these was efficient, but it worked out not to be the case. So mainstream economists like Afner Offer just said it just didn't work. So I think those will be ones which fall into this third category of it benefits the future and I can't see any high moral risk. I actually favor power sharing ones, and I think that's better at governing for the long term. But, you know, there's still a worry about, you know, it's not that it comes cost free. They might be slower to act decisively. And that's why I think that's an interesting problem then, that you might think they're better at preventing future problems, but when they arise, they're less good at coping with them. So it might be, yeah, I mean, I oscillate in my optimism, but I tend to find the analysis of the causes of the problem more persuasive than the answer. So if others have got better proposals, I'm all ears. Yeah, I worry about lots of the things that I put forward as proposals, that they might be ineffective. We have no evidence, right, of lots of them, or if they're effective, they might come at a high moral cost. I suppose I think it can't be the case that this is the best of all possible worlds and there are no ways of improving things. And so like Derek Parfit had theory X, I'm looking for institutional proposal X that doesn't come up with high moral costs, but is effective. And I suppose I wager that not all of them would, yeah, fall afoul of the ineffectiveness or morally dangerous. But you put your finger on what I am worried about, which is people messing up at one time and then binding the future, especially given how fallible our understanding of the future is. And actually, I'll just end with one thing. So I read a lot of public policy stuff while doing this, and there's a book on policy fiascos. And what was really interesting was there were things that were decided at T1, they thought it was a brilliant idea. At T10, they thought it was terrible, it's a fiasco. And then at T20, they revised it again because things had changed and in fact, well, looked terrible 10 years. So that makes it even harder to govern well for the future. I'm looking for optimism here, but yeah, thanks for that, Adam. That's really helpful.
No, thanks so much for that was a great answer. I just share your general disposition here. So we have maybe, let's say 3 to 4 minutes left. Does anyone else want to jump in? Any follow-ups for that?
Any proposals? Any, why haven't you thought about this?
Well, we've got a few minutes left. So actually, I've always been curious because I know you, so you published an article, I believe, in this like a collection of articles from 2016, you know, Institutions for Future Generations one. And I think a few people in that collection are very favorable towards sortition or using random selection. And I've always been curious. So what do you think about these sorts of proposals? Because one thing I've noticed is that, well, there's all sorts of systemic issues that could detract from our ability to govern well. So it's not even just short-termism. So you might think rent-seeking and political capture are problems, and you might think widespread political ignorance are a problem. But then you get these people who are probably more optimistic than you or I, or people here who are who are the sort to say, well, you got your random lotteries and they'll fix all of these problems. So maybe, is that correct, or is that too optimistic in your view?
Yeah, well, I am guessing from your accent that you're from Ireland. Is that?
That's correct.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that. Not, I mean, it's relevant for reasons you might, because
Yeah.
Ireland has used this for, what was it, for abortion and for gay marriage, or?
There's been a few things. They've been using citizens' assemblies for a while, and some related to climate change as well, I believe.
Right.
Which is very relevant today.
Yeah, I mentioned Ireland because people often look to the Irish citizens' assemblies, and then there are ones in Canada, and I mean the UK has had one on climate change, and France, Emmanuel Macron set one up, and but Ireland, I know, as you said, has had a history of using it, and people have been quite praising of it. So let's think. I haven't come to a final view on it. I mean, I do kind of, I have said something in favor of having a global one, because the climate change negotiations take place each November, December, and in Glasgow, a global one was set up, and I thought you know these tend to be dominated by political elites, and no one has any other power or say who isn't. But here was an attempt to randomly select people from all over the world and get them to deliberate and issue some recommendations. And you know, you can't democratize that process, but you can do random selection. And so I've expressed some sympathy or at least curiosity in it. But here are the issues. So let's think it through systematically. We have to think, well, what are the drivers of the problem? Will they be any less short-termist than everyday citizens? I think maybe the answer is supposed to be that they wouldn't be short-termist because they would deliberate and they'd be an environment presented with information. But you know, I suppose there's a first image kind of thought about, well, if human beings are disposed to be quite short-termist, what would make them special or different? And there's an awful lot of magic thinking that goes along in this domain about institutional proposals, where everyone says people are craven and short-sighted. But my proposal, we've got you know, an impartial, far-sighted person who's terrific. So we've got to be wary of that phenomenon. I suppose the case for it is something like they're not subject to elite capture, and they don't have the electoral incentives that others do. But then I think there's a question about, well, what role do these really play, these citizens' assemblies? So there's some people like, well, Alex Guerrero, right? So his view is it's not that they should advise and then there's a referendum, which is what happened in Ireland, I think. It's that they should actually make the decisions. And yeah, I have reservations about that. So actually, yeah, Alex does have a page in his Philosophy and Public Affairs article. He says they will be less short-termist. But I think, why won't they be fairly short-termist? Because they each hold office for a short period of time, and then someone else is randomly selected, and then someone else is randomly selected. At least with elected politicians, they're often in there for the long haul, and they want to see something through. So I suppose I worry there about their effectiveness in thinking through the long term. So this is very wordy, but I'm just kind of thinking through it and wondering, would they cope better with some of these? And I think on one front they might. They're not subject to the short-termist pressures of private actors seeking re-election. On the other hand, we can't just stipulate that they're going to be better and less myopic. And I do worry about disjointed policy when you've just got a new crowd in each time. So I'm still mulling it over and trying to make my mind up. But those are some of my thoughts on this. I'm not against them, but I'm slightly, I'm yet to be persuaded that it's the panacea that others see. I don't know, what do you think? What others think?
I feel slightly guilty because Alex was my dissertation supervisor, but I also have these reservations. I think it's even, you mentioned the disjointed or disjunctive policy decisions. I think it's even more serious than that, because on Alex's proposal, we would move from a general legislative body to a specific special issue or single issue legislative body.
Yeah.
So for example, you'd have 300 to 500 people randomly selected, and they would be for education, say, and another group of people for transport and agriculture. And maybe you have the future generations group, but to integrate all of those outputs into a one coherent whole might be difficult. To be fair to Alex, I'm sure he would recognize that this is a difficult problem. And I know he's got a book coming out shortly, or next year or so. So maybe he'll convince us, but like you, I just think this is very difficult. So
yeah, no, I totally agree with that. He's very insistent in that paper in Lotocracy that they be these single issue constituencies, and but you could have someone who favors sortition and doing lots that just says, no, I want there to be a legislature made up of covering all issues, made up randomly selected. And Philippe Van Parijs has a book where he kind of briefly argues for this. So I would favor the Van Parijs one over, for exactly the reason. I mean, if you think of something like climate change, it's got tentacles that reach into every single policy domain. So it's really hard to think, well, you deal with climate change, but someone else will deal with agriculture, and then someone else will deal with energy, and someone else will deal with high tech. Since they all use energy, I just think it makes sense to have a single one. But I kind of wonder if it still has a role to play in political life, and it has a role in bringing deliberation in, and a role in bringing everyday citizens whose voices generally excluded into the process. So I'm still mulling over that aspect, and there are people sometimes propose there be future councils populated by randomly selected citizens, and yeah, I'm mulling that over. So I haven't really made a final decision, but I think I think you and I are on the same wavelength when it comes to, is it the panacea? I don't think so, and I do worry about Alex's proposal in particular about disjointed decision making over time and across policy domains.
Thanks so much. That was great. So we're just about out of time, actually. So maybe we should call it a day. So please, everyone, join me once more in thanking Professor Caney for that excellent and fascinating talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the great comments and questions. And yeah, for your contributions. That's been really helpful.
All right. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thanks for organizing, Adam. Much appreciated.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.